It was 3:47 a.m. when David Miles sat alone in the corner of his luxury apartment. Surrounded by silence so thick it almost screamed. The lights of the city glittered far below, indifferent to the storm churning within him. Just hours ago, he was in the boardroom of his million-dollar company, giving what should have been a victorious pitch. But now, he sat barefoot, in a t-shirt soaked in sweat and something more invisible, despair. David had it all: a thriving tech startup, a penthouse in downtown Chicago, a car collection, and enough public praise to feed any ego. But beneath the shell of success lay a soul deeply disconnected. Something was missing, something he couldn't name, much less buy. That night had broken him. The deal he'd spent a year building crumbled. Investors walked away, citing a lack of authenticity. It wasn't just a business failure, it felt like a divine judgment. As if the universe had turned its face away. He stared out the window, not really seeing. The room was quiet, but inside, his mind shouted, "What's the point of any of this?" That's when he whispered, barely audible, "God, are you there?" He hadn't prayed in over 20 years. Not since his mother died when he was 17, leaving behind only a Bible with highlighted verses and the scent of lavender. Back then, he had prayed every night, prayed to keep her alive. When those prayers went unanswered, he closed that door forever. But something in him broke open now, not in anger, in surrender. David fell to his knees, not out of ritual, but instinct. He didn't know the right words. He didn't know how to pray anymore. But he tried anyway. "God, I don't know if you hear me. I don't even know if you're real. But I can't do this alone anymore. I've got everything they told me to chase, and I'm still empty. If you're there, please, help me." Silence. And then, something else. Not a voice, not a sign, but a shift, a quiet, a pause, a moment of stillness so pure. It silenced the chaos inside him. It wasn't magic, nothing around him changed, but something within him began to soften, like soil being prepared for new seeds. That was the first prayer David made as a man. Not as a CEO, not as a leader, not as a brand, but as a soul. And that moment would begin a journey, not just toward belief, but toward transformation. A journey of rediscovering what it means to connect with the divine, not through dogma, but through presence, not through perfection, but through surrender. Little did he know, that whisper in the night would change the entire course of his life, his business, and his legacy, forever. David didn't sleep that night. After his whispered prayer, he sat still on the hardwood floor, leaning against the cold wall, staring into the dim orange hue of dawn. A strange sense of clarity washed over him, not euphoria, not enlightenment, just space. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't spiraling in loops of planning, pitching, worrying, or calculating. He didn't even realize how rare silence had become in his life until that morning. At 7:12 a.m., his phone buzzed. Usually, he would have grabbed it before the second vibration. That morning, he didn't even flinch. He watched it buzz across the counter and fall still. Somehow, he knew it could wait. He walked into the bathroom, looked at himself in the mirror, and was startled by what he saw. Not because he looked different, but because, for the first time, he really looked. The dark circles under his eyes, the stress lines across his forehead, the slight tremble in his hands, these weren't signs of power. They were signs of depletion. He looked like a man who'd spent a decade running from his own soul. As the water ran down his face, he whispered again, not to himself, but to that same presence he had reached for in the night. "Help me start over." Later that morning, David found himself doing something he hadn't done in 23 years. He pulled his mother's old Bible from the top shelf of his closet. The leather was cracked, the pages slightly yellowed. Tucked inside were notes she had written, verses circled in blue ink. Little comments in the margins. As he flipped through the pages, one caught his attention. The ink had faded, but her handwriting was still gentle and firm. Psalm chapter 46 verse 10, "Be still, and know that I am God." Sometimes stillness is the loudest prayer. Mom. David read it over and over. Be still, know, God. He didn't pretend to understand what it meant entirely, but something in it resonated. He realized he had built his entire life on the opposite of stillness. Meetings, deals, speeches, strategies, success was noise, and he had mastered the volume. He closed the Bible, not out of disinterest, but to digest. He needed to sit with that verse. He didn't want a spiritual performance, he wanted something real. Over the next few days, David began what he called his experiment with silence. He set a simple rule: 15 minutes every morning, no phone. No music, no to-do list, just him, a chair by the window, and a quiet, whispered intention. God, if you're there, I'm listening. At first, those 15 minutes were torture. His mind screamed with unfinished tasks and doubts. But gradually, something shifted. He wasn't hearing voices or seeing visions, but there was a softening. Peace didn't rush in like a flood, it leaked in like light through a crack. And with peace came curiosity. He began to read, not religious dogma, but books on spiritual practices, the neuroscience of meditation, even business leaders who attributed their clarity to prayer. What surprised him most was how many highly successful entrepreneurs maintained some form of spiritual discipline, not as a crutch, but as a compass. He stumbled across a podcast interview with a former hedge fund manager turned monk. The monk said something that struck him deeply. Prayer isn't about escaping the world, it's about seeing the world differently. When you pray, you don't change the situation, you change your position within it. David paused the recording. He rewound that sentence 3 times. Change your position within it. He realized that's what had begun to happen. His circumstances hadn't improved. His company was still on the edge of collapse, but his inner world was quieter. For the first time in years, he wasn't panicking, he was paying attention. One morning, around day 10 of his new ritual, David asked a new question. God, what do you want from me? It wasn't rhetorical. It was the first time he asked not what he wanted from God, but what God might want of him. The question lingered in his heart all day. Later that evening, while reviewing old journals and notes from past meetings, he stumbled across a sketch he had made years ago. It was a simple drawing of a community tech hub, a free space where kids from underprivileged areas could learn coding and design thinking. It had been one of his earliest dreams when he first started his company, but somewhere along the way, he had buried it under the weight of profit margins and growth charts. His breath caught. Was this what he was being reminded of? Had he traded vision for vanity? That night, he didn't pray for success. He prayed for alignment, and that was the beginning of everything. The following Monday, David stepped back into his office for the first time since the fall. The energy in the building was different, more cautious. Colleagues glanced at him with a mix of sympathy and guarded respect. He was no longer the untouchable CEO. He was the man who'd almost lost it all. But David wasn't there to pretend everything was fine. In fact, he wasn't there to pretend at all. Cancel the strategy meeting, he told his assistant as he walked in. Let's call a team huddle instead. Something real. At 10 a.m., about 30 employees gathered in the main conference room. The space, usually filled with metrics and PowerPoints, was stripped bare. David walked in without a laptop, without a script, just him, and a different kind of energy. I know what you're all thinking, he began, that I blew the biggest deal of our year, that maybe I'm losing my edge. And you're not wrong. He paused, scanning the room. Silence. But I want to be honest with you. Something happened to me last week. I won't bore you with the spiritual stuff unless you ask, but I realized I've been building this company with the wrong compass. He took a breath. I was building a machine, not a mission. Eyes widened. A few glanced at one another. David continued. I started this company with a vision to create access, tools that empower people who are normally shut out. But I let the noise of the industry drown that out. I stopped listening, to myself, to you, to what we were meant to be. His voice didn't shake, but his tone was deeply human. I don't have a flashy recovery plan. What I do have is a renewed desire to lead with meaning, not metrics. And if you're willing to build that with me, not just for quarterly growth, but for impact, I'm here. Not just as your CEO, but as your partner. There was no applause, just stillness, and then, slowly, nods. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he was leading, not with force, but with presence. That night, he returned home to a quiet apartment, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt intentional. He sat in the same chair by the window, opened his notebook, and wrote. Today, I spoke without defending, I led without performing. Maybe prayer doesn't change the world, but it's definitely changing me. He prayed again, but this time, it was less about desperation and more about direction. God, keep softening me. I don't want to go back. In the days that followed, David's practices deepened. He added an evening routine, 10 minutes of silence before bed, reviewing his day not just through the lens of performance, but of purpose. He began noticing his own reactions, how often he interrupted, how rarely he listened, how quickly he judged. Prayer wasn't just a morning ritual anymore. It was becoming a lens for how he lived. One afternoon, he met with Julia, his former co-founder who had left the company 2 years ago after a bitter disagreement about the company's direction. She had always been the soul of the brand, while David had been the engine. But as the company scaled, he pushed her out, politely, professionally, but decisively. They hadn't spoken since. He reached out and invited her to coffee, not to pitch or recruit, but to apologize. She arrived wary but curious. "I'm not here for anything other than honesty," he said after a few minutes of small talk. "I wronged you. I let vision become vanity. You were trying to keep us grounded, and I was chasing applause. I'm sorry." Julia's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in disbelief. "You're different," she said finally. "What happened?" David smiled. "I started praying." She chuckled. "You, Mr. Strategy?" "Yeah," he said. "Turns out prayer isn't about being holy. It's about being honest. And I had a lot of honesty to catch up on." She didn't say much after that, but she didn't leave either. They talked for hours, not about business, about people, about legacy, about what it means to build something that matters. Before they parted, she said, "If you're serious about building with heart, I might be open to helping again, but I won't be a puppet, and I won't let you forget why we started." David smiled. "That's exactly why I called." That night, as he journaled again, he wrote, "It's not just about prayer. It's about posture, about finally facing the mirror without trying to control the reflection." He felt a new kind of courage rising, not the bravado of pictures or power suits, but the quiet courage to admit fault, to restore relationships, to choose purpose over pride. The road ahead was still unclear. Investors hadn't returned. The market was still volatile. The brand had lost visibility. But David no longer measured success the same way. Now, success meant alignment. Success meant peace. Success meant obedience to something higher than the bottom line. As David spent more time in silence, the weight of his decisions began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. He started to realize that his entire life had been a series of choices made without full awareness. His ego had run the show, seeking validation, recognition, and success, but deep inside, he knew that none of it brought him peace. He had come to understand that true prayer wasn't about asking for something. It was about learning to listen. The more he practiced this, the more he felt connected to a deeper purpose. But it wasn't a destination. It was a journey. David started looking at his business through this new lens. It wasn't just about growth anymore. It wasn't about competing for market share or scaling faster than his competitors. It was about serving his team, serving his customers, serving a higher cause that transcended profit margins. One morning, as he sat in his office, gazing out at the city, something occurred to him. What if the success of his business was directly tied to the success of his community? This thought hit him like a bolt of lightning. David had always viewed his company as a product, a tool for innovation, a platform for employees to grow and thrive. But now he saw it differently. His company wasn't just a tool for economic success. It was a vehicle for something much larger. He called a meeting with his senior leadership team that afternoon. And this time, there was no agenda, no quarterly reports, no business strategies. "Let's talk about our impact," David began, his voice clear but measured. "I've been so focused on what we're doing, how fast we're growing, that I've lost sight of why we're doing it." The team was quiet. They were used to David's meetings being dominated by numbers, by performance metrics. But today, it was different. His tone was softer, more reflective. "I want us to begin a new chapter, one where our success is measured not just by how much money we make or how many products we sell, but by the lives we touch, the communities we serve, the positive change we bring." He paused and let the weight of his words sink in. "I know this sounds idealistic, but honestly, the way we've been operating hasn't been working. We've been chasing the wrong things. If we really want to leave a legacy, something that matters, we need to get back to why we started." The response from his team was mixed, but no one challenged him. Instead, many of them seemed relieved, like they'd been waiting for someone to acknowledge the truth. Over the next few weeks, David met with various department heads and employees, asking them to share their thoughts on how the company could realign itself with a sense of purpose. Some had doubts, some had no idea what he meant by impact or community. But as they spoke, David found himself listening more than ever before, not just to their words but to the energy behind them. The team's voices were the prayer now. Their needs, their desires, their struggles, they all became part of the dialogue he was having with the divine. During one of these conversations, Maria, the company's head of marketing, asked a question that David hadn't expected. How do we measure impact? David, we measure profits all the time. But how do we measure if we're really making a difference? David smiled, grateful for the question. That's the question, isn't it? How do we measure lives changed? How do we measure peace, connection, or hope? He paused, then said, I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think the first step is to stop treating people like numbers. We need to start treating them like partners, people whose lives we're called to serve, not just to profit from. That evening, as he reflected on the conversation with Maria, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. It wasn't going to be easy. The business world didn't measure success by the lives it touched. It measured it by how much revenue you brought in, how many customers you acquired, and how quickly you scaled. But David realized that this was where prayer had taken him. The shift he had felt wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone, about the people who worked for him, the people who bought his products, and the people who needed to feel like they mattered. He closed his eyes and whispered again, God, I don't know how to do this, but I know I can't do it alone. Show me the way. The next day, he called a company-wide meeting. For the first time in years, he didn't talk about profits or products. He didn't mention growth or innovation. He didn't even mention the competition. Instead, David shared a vision that was more than just corporate speak. It was a call to action, a call to redefine success. I want us to be the company that isn't just known for making great products. I want us to be known for making a great impact, not just on the world, but on the people we work with, the customers we serve, and the community we build. He looked around the room. We can do this, but only if we're willing to be honest with ourselves and each other. If we're willing to pray together, not just for success, but for purpose. A quiet murmur ran through the room. Some were skeptical, some were curious, but David could see a change in the air. It wasn't just his words, they were beginning to feel it too. As the weeks passed, the changes began to take root. David no longer led with a focus on profits or sales. He began leading with a focus on people. And as he did, he saw that the company began to thrive in ways he hadn't expected. Customer loyalty deepened, employee engagement grew, investors, who had once been concerned about the company's shifting direction, began to see something different. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the heart behind the business. It was the authenticity, the purpose. David's journey was still unfolding. But he knew this. Prayer had transformed him. It had opened his eyes to a world beyond metrics and margins. It had shown him a new kind of leadership, one rooted not in power, but in service. And it was in that service, in that prayer, that he finally found what he had been searching for all along. A few months into his transformation, David began to realize that true change was not as simple as just shifting his mindset. The external world, his company, his relationships, even the pressures of daily life, hadn't stopped moving. In fact, it often felt as if the noise had gotten louder, the expectations heavier, and the weight of his new commitments more intense. David had underestimated one crucial thing: the resistance. One evening, he was in a late-night strategy session with his executive team, going over the latest financial reports and evaluating the impact of the new direction they'd taken. The room felt heavier than usual. He could see the doubt in some eyes, the hesitation in others. Maria, the marketing head, spoke up. David, I appreciate the vision you've set. I really do. But you have to understand, we're working in a cutthroat industry. The customers, the investors, they don't care about our purpose or our impact. They care about one thing: profit. And if we can't deliver that, we're done. David had anticipated this conversation. He had known that not everyone would buy into his new approach immediately. But hearing Maria, someone who had been with him since the early days, voice her concerns stung more than he expected. I understand where you're coming from, David said, his voice calm but firm. But we're not here to chase numbers for the sake of numbers. If we only focus on profit, we're no better than the companies that exploit people for a quick buck. We've been given a platform to make a difference, and that's what we're going to do. The room was silent for a moment. Maria shook her head, her voice tinged with frustration. David, you're asking us to abandon everything we've worked for, everything we've built, on faith. Faith that people will somehow change their priorities. But faith doesn't pay the bills. David looked around at his team, his closest collaborators. He could feel the tension in the air. He had walked into this meeting full of hope, but now, he was facing something much more difficult than he had anticipated: doubt. That night, David sat alone in his office, replaying the conversation in his mind. His prayer that evening was raw. God, what am I supposed to do? This isn't what I imagined. The world is pushing back. People don't understand. I can feel their fear, and I'm starting to feel it too. I need you to show me the way. For the first time in months, David felt uncertain. He had walked into the unknown with confidence. But now, faced with real-world challenges, that confidence was beginning to wane. Was his vision too idealistic? Was he trying to change something that wasn't meant to be changed? He sat in silence for what felt like hours, waiting for some kind of clarity. Nothing came. The next morning, as he walked into the office, David felt a heaviness in his chest. The usual excitement of a new day was gone. Instead, there was a sense of dread. But then, as he made his way through the halls, something caught his eye. One of the junior employees, Zoe, was sitting in the break room, her head down, scribbling something furiously in her notebook. David had never paid much attention to Zoe before. She was a quiet, hard-working member of the team who didn't seek the spotlight. But today, there was something different about her. He walked over and sat down next to her. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled, then smiled sheepishly. "It's nothing really, just some ideas I've been thinking about." David glanced at her notebook and saw page after page filled with sketches, notes, and scribbles. He was struck by how much passion and energy were packed into those pages. But what caught his attention most was the title at the top of the page: Reimagining Our Purpose. "This is incredible, Zoe," David said, his voice soft but full of wonder. "Tell me more." Zoe looked at him, her eyes wide. "Well, I've been thinking about the direction the company is heading in, and I know it's risky, but I think there's a way to do what you're saying: connect with people, create a real impact, and still be successful. We don't have to abandon profits, but we can change how we measure success. We can combine both." David stared at her, a sense of awe filling him. This was the breakthrough he needed. "You've got the right idea, Zoe. We can combine both. We don't have to sacrifice one for the other. We just need to get creative." Later that week, David called another meeting, this time with a new energy. He shared Zoe's ideas with the leadership team, encouraging everyone to think outside the box. The conversation was different this time, more collaborative, more open. It was clear that the shift David had been hoping for was starting to take hold. His team wasn't just following him anymore. They were coming up with their own solutions, their own answers. David realized then that this was the real power of prayer. It wasn't just about him asking for guidance. It was about becoming open enough to receive wisdom from unexpected places. Prayer had opened his heart, and in turn, it had opened his eyes to the voices of his team. Over the following months, David's company slowly began to shift in subtle but significant ways. They launched a new initiative focused on giving back, offering free coding classes to underserved communities and donating a portion of their profits to educational programs. But most importantly, they began measuring success differently. They didn't just look at the bottom line, they looked at the impact they were having on the world around them. And the results were profound. Customer loyalty grew, employee satisfaction soared. Investors who had initially been skeptical started seeing the long-term value in the company's new direction. They weren't just investing in products, they were investing in a vision that mattered. David sat in his office one evening, looking at the numbers, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. Prayer had shown him the way, not just to build a successful company, but to build something that truly mattered. It wasn't about abandoning success, it was about redefining it. David sat at his desk, looking out the window as the rain poured down in steady sheets. It had been a year since he'd first set out on this journey. And though the company was doing better than ever, there were still moments when doubt crept in. The numbers were up, the team was aligned, and the mission was clear, but the road had not been easy. The change he'd hoped for had not been without its sacrifices. There were employees who didn't understand the shift in priorities. Investors who questioned the long-term impact of focusing on purpose over profit. Competitors who saw his company's ethical stance as a weakness to be exploited. Every day, he had to remind himself of the bigger picture, the one that was grounded in something more profound than the immediate results. But despite the success, David still felt a pull, a sense that there was something more he was being called to do. He had built a thriving business, but it was no longer just about business. It was about legacy. It was about impact. One afternoon, David received an unexpected phone call from a former mentor, Robert. Robert had been a father figure to David when he first started his career. He had guided him through some of the early struggles and had always reminded him that business was about people, not just profits. David, Robert's voice crackled through the phone. I've been hearing a lot about your company's new direction. I'm proud of what you've done, but I want to ask you something that's been on my mind. David braced himself. He knew Robert well enough to understand that this wasn't going to be a light-hearted conversation. Are you sure you're not walking away from something important? I've seen this before. Companies that lose their edge, lose their ability to compete because they start focusing too much on idealism. People can admire your heart, but at the end of the day, they want results. You're playing a dangerous game. David paused, his mind racing. The old doubts that had once haunted him started creeping back in. Was he losing his edge? Was his commitment to purpose making him weaker in the eyes of others? But just as quickly as the doubt came, he shook it off. He knew that this was a moment of temptation, a test of his faith. I hear you, Robert, David said, his voice steady. But I've seen the results of the path we're on. The work we're doing is making a real difference. We're helping communities, we're empowering people, and we're building something that lasts. I won't let fear of failure pull me away from that. There was silence on the other end of the line. And then Robert spoke again, his tone softer. I understand. But just remember, David, success doesn't come easy, and you'll have to fight harder than ever to prove that this vision can succeed. Stay true to what you believe in, but don't let that make you naive. David nodded, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He knew Robert was right. This journey wasn't going to be easy. There would always be people who questioned him, who doubted the path he was taking. But that was the nature of change. It was messy, uncertain, and uncomfortable. But if he stayed true to his faith, if he continued praying for wisdom and strength, he knew he would find a way forward. As weeks turned into months, the external challenges didn't lessen. If anything, they intensified. One of their largest investors started pushing back, wanting to see more traditional returns on their investment. The marketing team struggled to make the company's new mission resonate with customers who were more concerned about price and convenience than ethical sourcing. And, worst of all, David began to notice that some of his employees were slipping back into old habits, focusing more on numbers and profits than the purpose-driven work they had once embraced. But David didn't give up. He remembered the lessons he had learned through prayer, the quiet moments of guidance that had come during his darkest times. Prayer was not just about asking for answers, it was about trusting the process. Even when the road felt difficult, one morning, David decided to take a walk through the company's production facility. As he passed by each workstation, he took the time to speak with his employees. He asked them about their work, about what they felt proud of, and about the challenges they were facing. There were some tough conversations. Some people expressed frustration with the slow pace of change, while others felt that they hadn't been properly supported. But in each conversation, David felt a deep sense of connection. He wasn't just managing a company, he was leading a movement. He wasn't just building a product, he was building relationships. Later that day, David called another meeting with his senior leadership team. This time, he didn't just want to discuss numbers or strategies. He wanted to remind them of the why behind their work. Let's be clear about something, David began, his voice calm but unwavering. We didn't start this company to make money. We started it to make a difference. I know that the financial pressures are real. I know that it's hard to stick to our values when the world keeps pushing us to cut corners. But we are not just a company. We are a force for good, and we can't forget that. His words seemed to resonate with the team. One by one, they spoke up, sharing their own frustrations and hopes for the future. Together, They brainstormed new ideas for how they could continue making a difference without sacrificing financial stability. The focus shifted from either or to both, and they could still grow, still make a profit, and still stay true to their mission. As David walked out of the meeting, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been long, and the road was still uncertain, but he had learned something invaluable. True leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about having the courage to ask the right questions, to remain grounded in faith, and to lead with humility. He knew the challenges would never stop. There would always be doubts, always be moments of fear and resistance, but with prayer to guide him and the support of his team, David was ready to face whatever came next. David closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. God, I don't know what the future holds, but I trust that we are on the right path. Give us strength to continue, give us wisdom to lead, and give us the courage to never stop serving. As the words left his lips, he felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that as long as he remained connected to his faith and to his team, he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months had passed since David first made his decision to integrate prayer and divine guidance into his life and business. The challenges, though still present, no longer seemed as insurmountable. It wasn't that the road had become easy, it was that David had learned how to walk it with faith. He had discovered that his strength didn't come from his ability to control every aspect of his life. It came from his ability to trust and surrender to a higher power, to listen carefully for wisdom in the midst of the noise, and to let that wisdom guide his decisions. Now, sitting in his office, David gazed out at the bustling city. The office was quieter than usual, as most of the employees had already gone home for the evening. But David stayed behind, as he often did, reflecting on the transformation that had occurred over the last year. The company, once driven solely by profit margins and numbers, was now centered around a much deeper mission, a mission of purpose and impact. They were no longer chasing growth for the sake of growth, but for the sake of changing lives. They were not just creating products, they were creating change. David closed his eyes for a moment, and as he sat there in the stillness, the weight of his journey began to settle in. The earlier days of uncertainty and doubt felt distant now. The fear of failure had not disappeared, but it had become a distant echo, drowned out by the louder voice of faith. He thought back to the many moments of prayer that had sustained him along the way. He had prayed when the path seemed unclear, when the challenges felt overwhelming, and when he wasn't sure if the changes he was making would be accepted by those around him. And yet, with each prayer, he had felt a sense of peace settle in his heart, a peace that didn't come from his circumstances, but from a deep connection to something greater than himself. David opened his eyes, and as the glow of the city lights spilled through the window, a thought occurred to him. This was the fruit of his faith. This was the purpose of his journey, not just the success of the business, but the deeper realization that he had become a conduit for something greater. The company was no longer his, it was the people's. It was theirs to nurture, to grow, and to help shape into a force for good in the world. As if on cue, his phone rang. It was Zoe, the young employee whose idea had sparked a new direction for the company months ago. David, I just wanted to update you on the progress of the new community project we've started. The first cohort of students has finished their coding classes, and many of them have already found jobs in the tech industry. We're seeing real change, David, real impact, and it's all because we took a chance, because you believed in something more than just numbers. David smiled, a sense of deep gratitude welling up inside him. This was the reason he had taken the leap. The reason he had prayed for clarity and strength when everything seemed uncertain. To make a difference, to change lives. You've done incredible work, Zoe, he said, his voice filled with emotion. This is just the beginning. We're going to change so many more lives. This is why we're here. But the path had not been without its challenges, and David knew that the journey was far from over. There were still moments of doubt, still questions about how to balance the business side of things with the mission of service. But David had learned to embrace those moments. He had learned that doubt wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a sign of growth. Every time he felt unsure, every time he was faced with an obstacle, he saw it as an opportunity to deepen his connection with the divine. Prayer had become his anchor, his source of strength and guidance in the midst of uncertainty. He thought about the many conversations he'd had with his leadership team, his employees, and even his investors. Through it all, one thing had remained constant: his commitment to his values. David had never wavered from his belief that success wasn't just about profits, it was about the impact they could have on the world. And as the company grew, so did his sense of purpose. There were still difficult decisions ahead. The company would continue to face challenges, both internal and external, but David knew that as long as he stayed rooted in his faith and his purpose, he would find the way forward. He had learned that leadership was not just about guiding others, it was about serving others. It was about listening to their needs, understanding their struggles, and offering support when it was needed most. David's phone rang again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time, it was Robert, his old mentor. "David, I've been watching from the sidelines, and I have to admit, I was wrong. I didn't think you could pull it off. I thought your focus on values would make you lose sight of what really mattered, results. But you've proved me wrong. I can see the difference you're making, and I admire your commitment to your vision. You've built something lasting, something that will outlast all of us." David paused for a moment, feeling a deep sense of gratitude toward Robert. The mentor who had once questioned his every move was now offering his full support. "Thank you, Robert," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned that when you stay true to your values, the results come in ways you never expected. We've created something more than just a company. We've created a legacy." As David ended the call, he sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He had not only transformed his business, but he had transformed himself. He had learned to trust, to surrender, and to rely on the power of prayer to guide him through life's challenges. And in that moment, David realized that the true power of prayer wasn't just about receiving answers, it was about being transformed. It was about opening his heart to the possibility of change, of growth, and of connection to something far greater than himself. It was about understanding that in the stillness of prayer, he had found the clarity and courage to walk a path that not only served him but served others as well. As David turned off his desk lamp and prepared to head home, he smiled. The journey was far from over, but he had found his foundation. With prayer as his guide, he knew that he was on the right path. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, he was a servant of something greater. And that made all the difference. The legacy he was building wasn't one of financial success alone. It was a legacy of faith, of service, and of impact.